Well, speaking of something the administration has done, part of the commission's work focused on building cyber capacity with our partners and allies and our friends across the world, and the concept of digital diplomacy. Obviously, the State Department now has its first ambassador for the Bureau for Cyberspace and Digital Policy. What do you make of the State Department's efforts so far? Are there enough conversations with folks abroad? Are we talking enough about digital infrastructure, international standards and norms? What do you think?
So obviously we fully support and helped write the Cyber Diplomacy Act. We believe it's the right thing to do. I believe that Nate Fick is the perfect initial ambassador. I think they have a great team there at State Department setting it up. I think they have a completely overwhelming job, which is trying to organize the federal government across 8 or 10 different federal agencies into a coherent partnership capacity building plan. And first of all, DoD is just on its own with a pocket full of cash saying we don't need your help, but you got to slowly bring them in, and then you have to look where are the gaps, where are the redundancies, get yourself an efficient plan. And I think the most important thing is, and he's lobbied hard for this, and it's in one of the defense bills, give him a separate pot of money to run the partnership capacity building program for the State Department. Once he's properly resourced, then Ambassador Fick will get all his phone calls answered, very rapidly. But he's doing a great job. He's engaging properly. I think we couldn't ask for anything else. And as Senator King said this morning, it's probably because he's from Maine. But in any case, that's been I think that's been an A+ effort by this administration.
Do you have specific lines of efforts for state, if they were resourced more, that you would, here's my wish list for you guys?
So we've written a paper on partnership capacity building, and we've got about 8 recommendations.
I didn't do my research, enough research, guys.
We've got about 8 recommendations in there. We've had Nate Fick come down for an event. I think he generally agreed with most of them, but he would say, I got to have the money to do that. And so we're working hard to see that happen.
And this is kind of part of my nerdy side. So you obviously were the ED of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And around the same time, there was the National Security Commission on AI. And as you just mentioned, there's a House Select Committee on the CCP. So it seems like a lot of these important issues are being tackled by these timed commissions, especially in emerging tech and policy areas. Do you think that's how policy in these critical areas is going to be developed moving forward? And then have these nonprofits and groups afterwards kind of continue the work?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, it had Eric Schmidt, Bob Work as our chairman, and Ili Bakhtari as our executive director, did a fantastic job. And certainly we wouldn't have been successful without them. They really supported us. They had a bigger challenge, which is that they didn't have 4 serving congressmen. And I haven't mentioned them yet, but Representative Jim Langevin put about 40 pieces of legislation on his back and carried them across the finish line on his own as a committee chairman in the House for 2 years. Having that allowed us to get a lot done. There are commissions out there. The best commission ever written, every report I ever read, was by Simpson-Bowles. And it explained with total certainty why having a $6 trillion budget was a totally crazy, bad idea, and that we needed to stop this, and gave us 19 recommendations, of which 0 have been executed. And as a result, we have a $33 trillion budget. And everything they said was 100% true and accurate. The president, President Obama, the leaders of the Senate and House said, this is a brilliant report, we're going to do all of it. We did none of it because it was politically hard. So commissions sometimes work, sometimes don't work. Our commission worked because we had 4 commissioners who were representatives or senators who grabbed each idea, strapped it to their staff's back, and pushed it through. We also had the advantage of cybersecurity being a completely nonpartisan issue. It really is. I've come across partisanship probably once in 120 bills I've written. Every other time you get 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats from each chamber, no problem, signing off on bills. When you have a nonpartisan issue and people want to tackle it, you're going to be successful.
Do you see that? So there's obviously AI. Do you see that also as a nonpartisan? I talked to Ili for our summer podcast. If you haven't checked it out, do it. Fault Lines, about the commission as well as about their special competitive studies project. Do you see these emerging tech areas? So putting the tech industry aside, but these areas that are kind of hard to grasp as an area for bipartisanship.
I do. I think artificial intelligence is going to be really hard because it cuts. Like right now, there are 65 committees that think they're responsible for cybersecurity, and they're a complete pain in the butt to each other and to us. But you eventually can work your way. There's a rule set to work your way through 65. Senator King mentioned today that on one provision, we actually needed 184 chairman and ranking member sign-offs over like a 5-day period. That's just ludicrous. But at least it's a manageable, measurable, there's a spaghetti chart for it. AI has no spaghetti chart. And the problem is no one's, I mean, and you saw it with Senator Schumer running an event where basically we won't have a hearing here. We'll just have like
Every voice.
a sit down around some chairs, and have really smart people come in the room and talk to us. So I think it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard for us if we decide that some kind of regulation we need in AI. God save us, because I don't think we'll be able to get that done.
As the last question, as a big picture, as you work forward on your, on your recommendations, as you take in these emerging technologies, where do you see cyber defense efforts moving forward?
So first, I absolutely believe what Chris Inglis says, which is that the 23-year commitment to a voluntary partnership between the public and private sector isn't working. I worked in the NSC in 1998. We wrote PDD 63 and the National Infrastructure Assurance Plan. We put everything in terms of a partnership, and it was voluntary. And I think after 23 years of doing something one way and it not functioning, to then determine you're going to do it for the 24th year would be clinical insanity. So, from my point of view, we absolutely have to get a better balance between incentivization, collaboration, and regulation. And it's going to take all three of them. There are areas, like I would never say regulate in water, because the problem is they're all broke. So if you regulate them, they're just not, you'll find people who don't have money. You need to incentivize them, provide financing. There's other places where you probably need to regulate. I think the other big issue is tackling where does the cloud computing industry sit in this. It and the space support infrastructure need to be added as critical infrastructures. But then how do you tackle, space I can understand how you tackle it. Cloud computing is going to be harder. If you try to regulate it, the three most effective government affairs teams in the world, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, are going to make a hard run on you. But if you try to find some kind of standard setting that says, look, if you're a significant critical infrastructure, or what Jen Easterly would call a systemically important entity, then you need this level of security. If you're just a regular critical infrastructure, you need this level. If you're Joe's dry cleaner, you need this level. But right now, it's based on what do you want to pay. And that's how the market works in America. And so we need to have some kind of standards for when you enter the cloud as that security environment for yourself. What is the minimum standard that you have to accept?
Great. I think that's all the time we have now. So thank you, Admiral, so much for joining us. And hopefully, I'm going to call up on stage my boss, NSI's founder and executive director, Jamil Jaffer, and of course, Jen Easterly, the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Perfect. Thank you. Well, I open this one. Too much stuff.
Hi. Hey, how are you? Great to see you too.
All right. Well, listen, thanks for being here all. And I'm thrilled today to be hosting Jen Easterly, the director of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I want to tell you a little bit about my friend, Jen. She's got a long, distinguished career in national security, 2 decades in uniform, 2-time recipient of the Bronze Star, responsible for setting up the Army's first cyber battalion, instrumental in the creation of U.S. Cyber Command, but then went on to run the Counterterrorism Center at NSA, where we first got to know each other, served as an executive assistant to Condi Rice, served in the Obama administration as special assistant to the president and senior director for CT. I mean, you've done it all. It doesn't even mention your private sector career at Morgan Stanley, where you headed up their Cybersecurity Fusion Center, you were the head of firm resilience, and now the director of CISA.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty storied career. I mean, tell us about, just for a second, and I know we didn't script this, right? So we didn't talk about career stuff, but that's not all you do. I mean, you're also a Rubik's Cube enthusiast.
I am.
And an aspiring electric guitarist.
I am.
Tell us about that for a second. I know we did not plan this.
Yeah, we did not plan this at all. Well, first of all, wonderful to be here. Congratulations on the new center.
Thank you.
In these types of jobs and the types of jobs I've had throughout my career, you often don't get an outlet to do things away from mission. You're constantly doing mission for all the right reasons. But a few years ago, I got really interested in electric guitar. My son got one, and then I decided that I needed one too.
Yeah.
So my husband gave one to me for my birthday, and I keep it in my office. So instead
love
of like getting on email, personal
just
email
have
or
a jam
social
session.
email, yeah. So we're doing, we've done a couple performances. We're doing one next week. So.
Well, I assume everyone here is invited.
Yes, you're all
Fabulous.
invited.
All right, well, great.
Exactly.
Well, look, let's jump into it. We've seen an explosion of innovation in just the last few months, the widespread use of large language models, generative AI, I mean, you name it. What are you seeing on the cyber threat front?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now it's difficult to distinguish between whether any of these capabilities are currently being used for cyber attacks or cyber intrusions. Certainly, we have significant concerns, and there's been a lot of talk around this, about the risks of these capabilities in terms of how quickly they're moving, how powerful they are,
Right.
and what these capabilities implicate with a whole range of risk, not just cyber risk. We're obviously responsible for infrastructure security as well, but risks from a physical perspective, bioweapons, chemical weapons.
Right.
And so I think there's a healthy focus now on what are all the things that we need to do to take advantage of the capabilities that AI and large language models will bring, but also to be able to protect us from the risks. And so, there's been a sprint, as anybody knows who's been reading this, since GPT, I guess 3.5 in November, a lot of work done within the federal government, along with industry, with our international partners. And what we've been doing at CISA is to develop an action plan that's very specifically scoped to our mission, because everybody in DC is doing some flavor
Right.
of artificial intelligence. And we wanted to make sure that what we were doing was just very relevant to cyber defense, threats to critical infrastructure, and then assuring AI systems, particularly those that are within the supply chain of critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
So we've put together a plan that we've already gotten a head start on, and there's going to be an AI EO, executive order, coming out, I think sometime in the next couple months, and some of this is we're trying to position us to get ahead of the things that we're going to be asked to do.
So, a lot of people have talked about the threats, the challenges in the AI domain, including the threats it might pose in the cyber and infrastructure domain. There are advantages here as well, right? These capabilities, we've already seen a variety of companies put out things like the Copilot and the like that can help cyber defenders. Talk to us about how the team at CISA is thinking about generative AI and these capabilities as a defense capability and not just as a threat.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a whole line of effort is how we're using these capabilities for cyber defense, which really just advances some of the work that we've already been doing based on machine learning. So, there is definitely some upside.
Right.
We're an agency that was built to reduce risk to the cyber and physical infrastructure that Americans rely on every day. And so what I want to make sure that even as we take advantage of some of these capabilities, we are being very, very mindful of the downside risks. So sure, there are great things that these capabilities will do, but they'll also do them for the adversaries that we deal with on a regular basis. I think I'm probably a little more skeptical than others you may have talked to about the value of these tools for cyber defense. And that's really because the head goalie on Team Cyber, it's tough to be a defender at
Right.
the end of the day. I
Right.
mean, we need to, in many cases, be able to defend the full enterprise of the
Everything.
infrastructure.
Constantly.
Not necessarily everything, but we have to be able to identify the most critical points
Right.
and then be able to defend them in depth. And attackers really, need to find the one weak point to be able to get in. And so I think there's already an overmatch where the benefit goes to the attacker. And I think we need to assume that, because as we are looking to mitigate the risks, we need to assume that these weapons will be used in really powerful ways by our adversaries. And I often talk about, I see these bringing incredible capabilities. I think it would be crazy to deny that they won't do incredible things, but they'll also be incredibly powerful from a weapon perspective. And when you think about the most powerful weapons of the last century, they were built and safeguarded by governments who were disincentivized to use them. These tools are largely being built by the private sector who are doing it from a profit shareholder value perspective. And so it's a very different type of problem set. And it's why the administration has been working to really get ahead of how do you manage these types of risks. And it's really hard. I mean, I had a meeting earlier this week with the CEO of Scale AI. Had a great discussion with Mustafa Suleiman, who was the co-founder of DeepMind, and just finished his book, actually, The Coming Wave, which talks about what are the 10 sort of important things that you need to be doing from a containment perspective. And he certainly recognizes, somebody who's been deeply embedded in this from a technical perspective, he recognizes the upside, but I think, in particular, he also sees the very, very significant downside. And so it's really, we need to all work together to minimize that.
And Mustafa and Ian Bremmer recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs arguing for governments to get much more active in this domain. Obviously we've seen the White House pull together a group of companies and get some voluntary commitments. There's this EO coming out shortly. You've heard a lot of talk on Capitol Hill about potential for regulation. The Hill, I think, is acting smartly and stepping carefully. They're doing a series of education sessions quarterbacked by Leader Schumer. But there is discussion, right? Senators Hawley and Blumenthal ostensibly have something of a bill coming out that may create an entity, an agency, may create requirements for certification or the licensing of entities. Talk to us about cyber risk reduction, though. So you've been at the forefront of creating things like the U.S. Cyber Command. You created the Global Cyber Fusion Center at Morgan Stanley, and now at CISA you've created the JCDC, right? The Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. Talk to us about why you decided to put JCDC together, what its mission is, how it operates, and how it's going.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. Well, Mark Montgomery and the Solarium crew actually came up with the idea.
Yeah.
This was one of the, I think, initial 75 recommendations that they made. And, I often say, there's so many, we've been in DC for so long, there's so many of these commissions out there.
Right.
And a lot of them create what ultimately becomes shelfware.
Right. This they didn't.
I will know. I mean, there's two. We've been around both. The 9/11 Commission, I think, was very significant for all the reasons that you know, and then the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And frankly, CISA benefited enormously. My great friend Chris Krebs and I kind of laugh because I benefited from everything that came in the NDAA for 2021, which largely came out of the recommendations of the Solarium Commission. And so when I sort of parachuted into the job in July, I had the benefit of a lot of additional authorities, additional budget in the wake of SolarWinds. But one of the things that the Solarium Commission recognized, and I was part of the red team, and so sort of weighed in
Me too.
from Morgan Stanley. That's right, we were there together.
I don't think they liked my red teaming, though. My red team was pretty tough.
Yeah, I was, I think I was a little tough.
I bet you were.
So anyway, one of the recommendations, having seen that the sort of face-off from government to the private sector was pretty incoherent, frankly, and I saw this at Morgan Stanley. I always go back to this sort of one canonical example. During SolarWinds, I was the cyber policy lead on the transition team, but it's still managing this from a Morgan Stanley perspective. And after SolarWinds, there were various products coming out from across government. There, I think, was something from FBI. There was something that came from CISA, specifically giving guidance if you had SolarWinds in your infrastructure. And we did not. And so we thought, okay, we're good. And then a product came out from the IC, I think it was NSA, a couple days later, that was focused on VMware. And we had VMware in our infrastructure. We were like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And we thought we were impacted. And so it was just an example of signaling coming from the government that was not coherent or cohesive. And I think the commission saw this, and it's one of the reasons they came up with this idea. It was called the Joint Cyber Planning Office. And it was all about creating, bringing together the federal cyber ecosystem. So in law, in legislation, it says CISA, FBI, NSA, ODNI, DOJ come together on one platform to work with the private sector on cyber defense planning and operations. And so when I came in, we stood up, I didn't like JICPO because I thought it sounded really terrible. So we, JCD, my joke is I tried to call it the Advanced Cyber Defense Collaborative, but they wouldn't let me. That's actually a true story. So JCDC, and since August of 2021, we've expanded from 10 companies to 200. And then we also work with 140 certs around the world, and then have collaboration channels with about 150 partners. And so, you know, and we've been able to put that to use from the initial Log4j issues, the Ukraine pieces in terms of the Shields Up campaign that we worked on. And then we've done a variety of things that are specific to zero-day vulnerabilities, very serious APT threats. And so, but you'll notice that the products that come out of JCDC typically have the seals of all of the, so we work very closely to be aligned and coherent. And more we've sealed with our international partners, because cyber defense is cyber defense. There's, you know, basically the ways that we are trying to reduce risk to digital infrastructure don't change. I was meeting this morning with my counterpart from Norway. And so much of what we do is very extensible into international infrastructure. And so it only makes sense for us to be aligned as much as we possibly can.
Well, look, I mean, obviously, if you'd gotten a call to ACDC, that would have been amazing.
That would have been amazing, I know.
But so let me ask about a point that you made. You noted that JCDC played a key role in the Shields Up effort, the defense of Ukraine, both abroad and helping our partners abroad get ready for what we expected would be an onslaught of Russian activity, but also the defense at home and protecting our infrastructure against what we believe would be a significant series of events against our own infrastructure. Talk to us a little bit about, we were now a year and 9 months into this campaign by the Russians, the illegal invasion of Ukraine. The US government has increasingly gotten more and more involved and more aggressive in our support of the Ukrainians. We're now on the verge of F-16s being in the fight. You know how important that will be, having served on the ground. Talk to us about the defense that we and the efforts we made before this all began, right? The Shields Up campaign at home, the effort to prepare our allies and our partners abroad. How did that work? What was CISA's role in that effort? And looking back now on a year and 9 months in, how do you think it went?
Yeah. So just to step back, I mean, I think folks know, but it's probably worth mentioning, you know, newest agency in the federal government specifically stood up in 2018 by the Trump administration to be America's civilian cyber defense agency. And so the mission really is all about protecting the digital and the physical infrastructure, the critical infrastructure here in the US. And so we have a lot of partners to include. We've been working with the Ukrainians for about 8 to 10 years, but we're really focused on the home defense. Now, put it in context of 2021, which started the year with SolarWinds, right? SVR intrusions into critical infrastructure, into government agencies, Colonial Pipeline, ransomware, likely state-sponsored, state-supported. And of course, knowing what Russia had been doing for years and years, particularly within Ukraine from a cyber attack perspective, we were very, very concerned about attacks here in the homeland, particularly in response to support for Ukraine, retaliation on US critical infrastructure. And so probably late in the year, late fall, ODNI, the NIM, came to me and said, we want to talk to you about these threats.
The National Intelligence Manager.
Yes, and he was Chris Porter at the time, came in and sort of said,
former NSI fellow.
Oh, there you go, it was great. So we sat down and kind of laid out what was happening, and we said, well, we need to get ahead of this in terms of being able to brief the private sector so we can prepare. And one of the great things during the, about the, you know, not about the invasion, but one of the great things that the US did, specifically the intelligence community, was really focus on leaning forward and declassifying as much information as possible. So we were briefing every sector at many levels of classification, but in some cases we were able to brief at the unclassified level, which is good for sort of state and local, because they don't have a lot of clearances. And so, from almost the end of the year up until the invasion in February, we had been briefing all of the sectors. We started our Shields Up campaign, which is about making sure that all of the sectors understood the threat, but also could take urgent steps to put mitigations in place to raise their cybersecurity baseline. And the feedback we got from that was pretty extraordinary. The CISOs who said, typically we don't get all the resources we need. It was pretty great that they were able to do a lot of things in a short period of time based on just a coherent approach to understanding what the threat was. And we also got to the board members so that they were aware as well, because of course they were fiduciarily responsible if there were threats that we're not prepared for. And so, we did a lot on the critical infrastructure side, but working obviously with the whole government on this. And I think it positioned us in a pretty good place. We always get the question of why didn't we see more here? I think the answer is major miscalculation on the part of the Russians. Thought it was going to be a cakewalk into Kiev. Didn't think the U.S. and the international community would be as unified as they have been. And so Putin, I think, correctly calculated, having been warned by the president after Colonial Pipeline that attacks against our critical infrastructure would be highly escalatory. And they've also been fully engaged in Ukraine. And we shouldn't fool ourselves that there hasn't been an enormous amount of activity. I think we need to give huge credit to the Ukrainian cyber defenders. We work very closely with SSS CIP and my friend Victor Zora, and we signed a memorandum of cooperation last year, and we've been working with them, both learning lessons from them and then helping them with areas of our expertise from the cyber defense and industrial control system. I think one of the key lessons that we're learning really is about the importance of resilience, not just cyber resilience, but operational resilience, and then, frankly, societal resilience, particularly when you think about the threats from China.
Yeah. You mentioned something I think important about this question of Russian attacks on U.S. infrastructure as being potentially escalatory, right? The president was very clear with President Putin about what would happen and how this would play out. And one of the issues here long has been, what we talked about for a long time, is this question of deterrence in the cyber domain. And NSA, Cyber Command have been freed up significantly by statute in recent years to get more active abroad, engaging in persistent engagement and defend forward activities across the board. I realize this is not your bailiwick anymore, but I'm interested to know in your mind, how important are those efforts to the deterrence that we either saw or experienced or whatever it was in the lead up to and the efforts going forward through the Ukraine campaign? The Russians haven't really come at us. I mean, they've come at us a little bit. We've defended effectively, but we haven't seen that onslaught that we expected. Is that deterrence working?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think you go back to the Joe Nye article, right? Deterrence and dissuasion in cyberspace. He talks about punishment, talks about deterrence by denial, norms, entanglement. I think you can take the latter two off the table here, but certainly I think punishment, escalation was a factor, but I also think there's a little bit of deterrence by denial and resilience, and that's the country coming together and raising the bar and being very focused on being able to mitigate risk from any sort of an attack that we did see. To your larger point, I guess I should just say, and it's not my mission area anymore, but we very closely collaborate with Cyber Command and the Cyber National Mission Force. And that has been another really good news story. Eric Goldstein, my head of cyber, and Joe Hartman, the head of the Cyber National Mission Force, have talked about this sort of virtuous cycle, this offense-defense flywheel, where during their hunt missions, they will find malware, and we can share with us to ensure that we can help inoculate critical infrastructure here at home, knowing more about what adversaries are deploying overseas. And we've done similarly in terms of what we see here in the US when we do hunts with critical infrastructure, helping to inform their operations. And so I think it's a really good news story for the government in terms of where we've advanced, and Paul calls it persistent engagement. I call what we do persistent collaboration. Because at the end of the day, we're not a regulator, we're a voluntary agency. And so everything that we do is built off the back of our expertise and our ability to create trusted partnerships.
And let's talk about that. And by the way, we are going to come to audience questions here in just a minute or two, so have your questions ready. But I do want to talk about this point that you made right at the end, right? This issue of persistent collaboration and this offense-defense flywheel. Sounds like it's working amazing in the government, right? The government's out there conducting its hunt missions, right? Its offensive capabilities, right? We're bringing it back, using it to defend at home. A key part of this operation, as you well know, because this is the front lines of your operation, is that collaboration with the private sector, both its role in Shields Up and getting ready to defend its own infrastructure, but learning from the government and taking those learnings, deploying them, and frankly sharing what it knows. And there is a little bit of regulation, right, in the incident reporting, right? Sharing what it knows with the government, so the government can defend better and collect better against threats to the homeland. Talk to us about how that flywheel is going. It's been one we've been talking about for a decade and a half. It's been hard to get spinning. Is it spinning?
No, I do think it's moving in a very good direction. I mean, you can't overestimate how big a transformation we are trying to catalyze is, because it has been decades of public-private partnership.
Right.
And even when I was at Morgan Stanley, that meant going to the FBI field office, every month and getting the secret level briefing.
Right.
It was not
in a closed room that you can't take out to your
exactly.
workforce.
It was not what I would really talk about as partnership. It was generally it was episodic, it was friction-filled. And it wasn't always adding value. It's good linkages if it wasn't like you never had a relationship, but it certainly wasn't what I would talk about as collaboration. And that's really what we've been trying to push forward. And Eric and I wrote about this in Foreign Affairs earlier this year, and it's really kind of focused on three things. First of all, a recognition that there has to be a default to share. Because a threat to one, from a critical infrastructure perspective, can be a threat to all, can be systemic. And so it's one of the things when we talked about with Shields Up, even CIRCIA was not in place yet, but we said report any incident or any evidence of suspicious activity because it may be a leading edge indicator, and we had a huge amount of reporting off the back of that. And so, we talk about this idea default to share. Second, kind of equal partnership between government and industry, where government is transparent and value added, and where industry does not have to fear punitive sanction for sharing information. And then finally, enabling a frictionless experience, and that's sort of shared platforms, simply Slack, where we're able to share information in real time. And imagine that. And always really looking to add value, which was not always what the government was doing. And so, yes, I think we are making progress, but it is, and in my discussions with CEOs and CIOs and CISOs, I think they recognize that this is not your granddad's government. We really are starting to make a lot of progress. But at the end of the day, it takes really hard work. It takes humility and transparency and assuming noble intent, and just really kind of being willing to, in some ways, take a chance on building a partnership.
Yeah, love it. Well, let's take some questions from the audience. We got about 10 minutes left, so who's got a question? Yeah, down in the front.
Hi, thank you for being here, Ms. Easterly. My name is Alicia Guidehouse. Thank you. I wanted to build on the conversation on public-private partnership. I do think that is so critical to being successful in this mission. I'm curious, do you have a sector and agency where you see successful partnership that we could model ourselves after?
Yeah, successful agency, you mean?
Agency-industry partnership.
Agency partner, there are federal agencies perhaps, or other sectors.
So we have a whole range of partners, right? So I think about it a little bit. So our federal partners, and when I talk about the federal cyber ecosystem, I really focus on the ones that were in the legislation to build the JCDC. So CISA, NSA, FBI, Cybercom, other aspects of DoD, then ODNI and DOJ. So, but the first four are really kind of the core of that. And I think the partnerships and collaboration now among NSA, FBI, CISA, and Cybercom is as good as it's ever been. Now, the sort of next level is all of what's called the sector risk management agencies. So we work with Treasury, which is the sector risk management agency for finance, energy, TSA for pipelines, and we sit at kind of the center of that in our role to be the national coordinator for critical infrastructure resilience and security. And that's really a recognition that you can't just say finance is squared away, because finance requires energy and telecommunications and water and all of that. So you have to manage and reduce the cross-sector risk. So we have been, over the past year or so, evolving the infrastructure, the scaffolding to really build that role effectively. Again, cross-sector risks. None of this really existed before we stood up CISA. So that's sort of within the federal government. And then from an industry perspective, we work with all 16 critical infrastructure sectors, but we work with them in a cross-sector way. So often our discussions are with various sectors in the room when we're talking about, one version of threat. The thing that we're most focused on now is on China. And I will just say from, the past 2+ years, I have had incredibly productive conversations with industry who recognizes that the government is really leaning forward and trying to provide more valuable information and trying to be more transparent about it. And so I've been really pleased to see the sort of tide turning on government and industry working together. And then, the state and local, so we work very closely with state and local as well. That's another flavor that is often the less resourced, and so it's a different type of partnership with them as opposed to what it might be with a Fortune 500 that has a lot of resources. And there we've really focused on ensuring that they are aware of all of our free resources, both physical and cyber assessments. And we have built over the past 2.5 years, a huge field force. So we have advisors out in the field who are sitting with state and locals, and also with some of what we call the target-rich resource poor infrastructure, K-12 schools, rural hospitals, water facilities, local election offices. And so, and then even separate from that, we've got all kinds of work with academia and then work with nonprofit. One of the JCDC planning initiatives is focused on high-risk community protection, so vulnerable communities that may be subject to things like Pegasus or spyware, working with them to know if they go into places where they may suffer repression, how to protect themselves. And so it's like a whole flavor of different partnerships that we work on. I would say across the board, I think they're all moving in the right direction, but we have to approach all of them knowing that there's no mandate to collaborate with us. We're a voluntary partnership agency, and so we have to add value. And we have to approach everything making it as friction-free as possible to help work with the government. And it's a different, I've been in the US Army, I've been in the White House in policy, I've been in the IC at NSA, been in the private sector. This is the most challenging because we are, a voluntary partnership agency, but like hands down, it's the most fun ever, because it's all about, they say technology is easy, people are hard. It's all about like figuring out how to, solve the people problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions? Yeah. Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Raimondi from Silverado Policy Accelerator. Thank you for being here today, Jen, and both of you. So I have a question about election security, because I missed the Montgomery talk, so I don't know if this is already covered, but CISA has played a significant role in helping with the election security, and also one of the top issues was truth versus myth, or what have you. That's going to be probably a lot more fun now with deep fakes and AI generated. So number one, I'm asking if you think, if you're already looking at that and preparing, and number two, whether you think the Prigozhin's plane falling out of a window will have any impact on the IRA and the other things he ran that presumably have been shut down to some extent?
Thanks for the question, Mark. Just to step back so everybody in this auditorium knows. So election infrastructure was declared critical infrastructure at the beginning of 2017.
Which means it's in your job description.
Well, it means, number one, it's critical infrastructure, and then we were chosen to be the sector risk management agency for election infrastructure. And so that's, and the federal government doesn't run elections, right? Our job is to work with state and local officials that run and administer elections and ensure that they have the resources, capabilities, information that they need to protect election infrastructure. And so it's interesting, Chris Krebs tells the story that when they first started working with state and local election officials, they wanted nothing to do with the federal government at all. I think they actually voted, the National Associations of Secretaries of State did a vote to basically put
Ignore the federal government.
Yeah, to put an opinion in place that we don't want to
Right.
work with the federal government. And off the back of Chris's hard work and Matt Masterson, who was a senior election security lead, they were able to really build incredible partnerships with state and local election officials that I very happily inherited when I came in 2021, and they're good to this day. And frankly, most state and local election officials, they are not partisan, right? They are doing this because they believe in democracy. They're serving on the front lines of it. The threat has become more and more complex over the past 6 years.
And more real.
And more real. I mean, we were very concerned on cyber, and I think we've done an enormous amount to try and improve the cyber security of election infrastructure. I think we're actually in the best place that we've been on that. But physical threats, which when you think about that, the harassment, the potential attacks, I mean, it's pretty horrific. Insider threats, and then foreign influence and disinformation. So we are really leaning into our support. We're in particular focused on those local election offices because at this point in time, the state election offices are actually in pretty decent shape given the resources that have been put in place. There's almost all paper ballots. There's huge private sector support. We brought in the JCDC, and there's a lot of free resources that certain vendors have brought to the table. But we are now very focused on the local offices, right? There's 8,800, I think, and don't quote me on the number, it's over 8,000, but getting down to the towns and the municipalities and the counties,
yeah.
right? Some of whom are, volunteer.
Yeah.
And so really trying to get down there, and I just asked my senior advisor, Kate Conley, who ran the Defending Digital Democracy at Belfer, to step in as our senior election security lead, and she's fantastic. So we are, and by the way, they, of course, the election officials are asking the same questions about AI capabilities and deepfakes, and we just did a product on deepfakes. But there will certainly be concerns that come out of the use of generative AI from a disinformation perspective that foreign adversaries, Prigozhin or no Prigozhin, will take advantage of. We've seen it with Russia, we've seen it with Iran, we've seen it with China. I think at the end of the day, though, why Americans should continue to have confidence in the integrity and the resilience of our elections is because of the incredibly hard work of state and local officials who for the past 6 years have been building capability and security measures in place to keep election infrastructure safe and secure. So I don't think anything from an AI perspective will change what we've put in place in terms of those measures. I think there are issues around confidence just in terms of the information environment, and we're going to work very hard using the same things that we've done before. You alluded to, Mark, rumor control. We're continuing to do that. We're continuing to amplify the voices, the trusted voices of local officials, and then continuing to work with our IC and FBI partners on what are the tactics of disinformation that are used by foreign adversaries and how could that impact the information environment. And so, we are doing everything we can to be proactive and get ahead of it. I think it'll be a challenging year, but I have great faith in the state and local election officials who are on the front lines of defending democracy, and there's no more important mission, obviously.
Well, I hate to do this. I know there are a lot more questions, but we are out of time. So I just want to thank Jen Easterly for being here. Thank you, Dr. Easterly. And thanks all of you for being here. By the way, there's a reception to follow. If you go down the hallway you came in, all the way to the end in the law school in the atrium, we'll have food and drinks. So join us and celebrate the opening of the Cyber and Tech Center here at NSI. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.